She was 17, broken bleeding, and left to die by her own father in the middle of the Arizona desert. But what if I told you that same girl would one day give birth to a miracle no one thought was possible? This isn't just a story of survival. It's a story of love, redemption, and the kind of hope that changes everything. Stay with us, because the ending will move you in ways you never expected. She was 17 when her father left her to die in the desert. No note, no goodbye, just a broken girl, a cracked jug of water, and a thin blanket tossed beside her like an afterthought. That's how it started. That's how Clara Whitmore's story almost ended on the dusty outskirts of Sedona, Arizona, where the red earth remembers everything, and the wind never forgets a scream. People often say the desert is empty, but they've never listened to it the way Clara had. The desert isn't silent. It hums, it aches, it watches. And on the day Clara was abandoned, it bore witness. The sun was merciless, high and heavy in the sky, baking the ground until it cracked like dry lips. The mesquite trees cast skeletal shadows that offered no comfort. Buzzards circled in lazy arcs, their wings cutting across the blue like ink stains. It was the kind of day that could turn a mistake into a death sentence, and John Whitmore didn't believe in second chances. Clara had been raised in the silence of that man, a former soldier turned rancher, whose heart had long since turned to gravel. Since her mother's death, the house had grown colder than the desert at midnight. No music, no laughter, no warmth. Just chores, commands, and that voice of his sharp as barbed wire. "You call that clean," he'd say, never looking up. "Do it again." She did as she was told always. She scrubbed the porch until her knuckles bled. She herded goats under skies that threatened rain, but never delivered. And every night when the house went dark and her body begged for rest, Clara would sneak to the hayloft with a tattered book hidden in a grain sack, Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, stolen from a forgotten library shelf. The poems were her secret, her rebellion. They spoke of places where people were kind, and stars didn't burn so cruelly. She read them aloud in whispers, savoring every line like a sip of water. It was her only escape until the mayor arrived. They called her Whiskey, and she lived up to the name wild, fiery, and dangerous. Clara wasn't ready to break a horse, but that didn't matter to John. He handed her the reins, pointed to the corral, and said, "Get on. No saddle. You fall, you get back up." She didn't get back up. The fall came fast and brutal. One moment, Clara was in the saddle, fingers clenched around the reins, trying to soothe the beast with a whisper. The next, the world spun sideways and her legs shattered beneath her like brittle branches. Pain like fire. Then silence. John didn't run, didn't kneel, didn't say a word. He stood over her, arms crossed. "You're useless like this," he said, then turned and walked away. No doctor was called. No neighbor alerted. Instead, he ordered 2 ranch hands to carry her to the property's edge. They dumped her at a forgotten trailhead, where a weather-worn sign once pointed to nowhere. Her father's last words, "Don't come back." So there she lay, 2 days, 2 nights, skin blistering, legs swollen and bent, wrong throat so dry it felt like ash. She didn't cry, not because she wasn't afraid, but because there was no one left who'd care enough to hear it. But the wind did. It rustled the grass around her like a lullaby. It whispered through the branches, asking her softly, "Are you still here?" Clara didn't know why she hadn't died. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was that voice inside her, her mother's voice, the one she hadn't heard in 7 years, saying, "You are more than this." Somewhere in that wasteland of heat and heartbreak, Clara found a flicker. Not hope. Hope was too big, too generous. But a flicker of defiance. A spark that said, "This is not how my story ends." The desert listened. It didn't send rain, it didn't send an angel, but it sent a man. A dog barked in the distance. Hoofbeats followed. Clara blinked at the blur on the horizon, unsure if it was real or just another mirage. But it didn't vanish. The figure grew closer, solid, deliberate. A man on horseback dust trailing behind him like smoke. A dog trotted beside him, tail high, ears perked. They stopped just feet from her broken body. The man dismounted, dropped to his knees, and let out a low, "Oh Lord." He wasn't young, wasn't handsome in the storybook sense, but his face was kind and his hands rough. Large, trembling, just slightly, were the gentlest thing she'd ever felt. He tipped water to her lips, held her head like it was something sacred. "My name's Nathan," he said. "You're safe now." Clara didn't believe in safety, not anymore, but she let herself believe in his voice. And as the sun dipped below the cliffs and the air cooled, Nathan lifted her into his arms and began the slow ride toward the mesa, toward a cabin hidden from the world, toward a story that hadn't ended after all. Because sometimes the desert doesn't bury you. Sometimes it gives you back to the world with new bones and a second chance. The desert had nearly claimed her, but fate or something like it had other plans. As the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of copper and bruised plum, Clara lay on the edge of consciousness. Every breath was an act of defiance. Her body was failing her mind, fraying at the edges, and then through the haze of heat and pain came the sound of a dog barking. It was faint at first, just a thread in the stillness. Then came the rhythmic thump of hooves on hardened ground. Clara dared not open her eyes at first. Hallucinations had already visited her in the form of dancing shadows and whispered voices. But this was different, real, anchored. A shape approached, large, upright. Not a coyote, not a spirit, a man. He dismounted with a grunt, the dog pacing anxiously beside him. "Sweet mercy," he muttered, kneeling beside her with careful urgency. Clara felt the cool shade of his body fall across her face, then the touch of a calloused hand brushing the hair from her brow. She flinched, but he didn't withdraw. He stayed, steady present. "Can you hear me?" he asked, voice low and strong. She tried to nod, but her neck refused. Her lips parted, but no sound escaped. The man reached for a leather canteen, uncorked it, and offered her water in slow, measured sips. The liquid was warm, metallic, but it tasted like life. "My name's Nathan," he said. "Nathan Hale. You're all right now, I've got you." She wanted to believe him, but years of silence and hurt made it hard. Still, something in his tone, grounded sincere, kept her from slipping back into the dark. He moved with the certainty of someone who'd done hard things before and survived them. With great care, Nathan wrapped her in the worn blanket she'd been left with, lifted her into his arms, and cradled her like someone holding a story too precious to drop. The dog Scout, she'd later learn, trotted beside them as they rode into the canyon's embrace, away from the place she'd been left to disappear. Nathan's cabin sat nestled between red cliffs and a patch of whispering junipers. Smoke curled gently from a crooked chimney, and the scent of pine lingered in the air. It wasn't grand, but it was whole. And for Clara, it was the first place that hadn't looked at her like she was broken. Inside, Nathan moved with quiet purpose. He boiled water, ground herbs with weathered fingers, and whispered instructions to himself like prayers. He cleaned her wounds, wrapping her legs in strips of soft cotton and splinting them with carved willow branches. Each touch was deliberate, strong, but never rough. He didn't ask questions. Not that night, not the next. He just watched her, fed her broth from an old enamel cup, and let her sleep. When she woke from fever-drenched dreams, he was there sometimes, humming tunelessly, sometimes just sitting in silence, eyes trained on the fire. Clara didn't know what to make of him. He looked like someone carved from the land, thick hands, sun-lined face hair streaked with silver. But behind the ruggedness was something else. Sadness, maybe, or solitude worn so long it had become part of him. He didn't smile much, but when he did, it felt like dawn after a long storm. One morning, after a particularly bad night of pain, she whispered her name. "Clara," she said. Nathan looked up from his carving knife. "Clara," he repeated softly, nodding like it was something worth remembering. "That's a strong name." Days passed. Then weeks. Nathan showed her how to grind herbs, how to boil roots for tea, how to listen to the trees for weather changes. She watched his hands and mimicked them, relearning how to trust her own body again. When her voice grew stronger, she began asking questions not about him, but about the world he'd built. He told her about his sister Anna, about the fever that came like a thief in the night and stole her future, about how he'd left Flagstaff and wandered until the land told him to stay. "I built this with my hands," he said once, gesturing around the small cabin. "It gave me purpose when I had none left." Clara didn't respond right away. She simply looked around at the neatly stacked firewood, the carved banister, the hand-stitched curtains, and nodded. She understood. Survival was one thing. Building something beautiful after pain, that was another. One day, she sat outside for the first time, her legs resting on a worn bench. Nathan handed her a small sketchbook and a piece of charcoal. "For when you're ready," he said. She was. She drew the mesa, then the dog. Then, one morning, she drew the man himself sitting by the fire, unaware. There were still nights filled with nightmares. She'd cry out, reliving the fall, the sting of her father's last words. But each time Nathan was there, not hovering, not fixing, just being, just present. And in the stillness that followed, Clara began to heal. Not just her body, but something deeper, the belief that she mattered, that her life was not defined by where it began or who tried to end it. And so, in the quiet of the mesa, with the red cliffs bearing witness and the stars spinning silently above, Clara began the slow journey back to herself. Because sometimes the people who save us don't arrive with sirens or angels' wings. Sometimes they come with calloused hands, quiet eyes, and a heart that understands exactly how it feels to be lost. The walls of the cabin were not just built from timber and nails, they were layered with quiet grief and now hope. Clara had been there for weeks, but the memories of the desert still clung to her skin. Some nights she could swear she still tasted sand in her mouth. Some mornings the light felt too much like that awful sunrise when she was left to die. Healing, she would learn, is not a straight path. It's a slow climb with broken steps. But Nathan, he never once rushed her. He was a man of few words and even fewer expectations. He didn't try to fill the silence with platitudes. Instead, he filled it with the smell of simmering broth, the soft scratch of a whittling knife, and the low thump of Scout's tail against the wooden floor. Clara found herself drawn to the simplicity of their routines. Mornings began with the crackle of the hearth and the creak of floorboards as Nathan moved about. He always prepared 2 cups of tea even before she was strong enough to leave bed. Some days she drank, some days she didn't. He never commented. He just sat, sipped his own, and waited. One day she surprised herself by asking, "Why 2 cups?" He shrugged, barely meeting her eyes. Felt right. And with that, a door cracked open between them. As the summer deepened, so did Clara's strength. Nathan gently encouraged her to sit outside during the warmest hours, shaded beneath the juniper trees. He carved a cane for her from a thick branch, smoothed it down, engraved a small flower near the handle, and left it by her bedside without a word. When she saw it, she cried for the first time since the fall. Not out of pain, out of recognition. He saw her. Not the bruises, not the break. Her. The days began to stretch into something more than recovery. They began to build a life. She learned to tend his garden, a small patch of soil near the back porch where lavender grew wild, and sage filled the air with its healing scent. Her hands, once used only for labor, found new purpose planting seeds. Nathan in turn began to talk. He shared more about his past, how he'd once been engaged long ago before illness and guilt drove him from town. How he had wanted children, but illness had taken that dream from him. He said it not with bitterness, but with a kind of reverent acceptance. I thought, if I kept building things he said one evening as they watched the stars emerge, I'd forget the things I couldn't have. Clara didn't speak. She just reached for his hand and held it. They fell into a rhythm that felt almost sacred. He taught her to carve wood. She taught him how to sketch. He'd never picked up a pencil for art, but she showed him how to trace the lines of the land, the folds of the mesa, the bend in a tree limb, the way Scout's ears perked at every sound. She drew constantly. It became her way of telling the truth without speaking. One night, she placed a small drawing above the hearth. Scout curled beside the fire, Nathan reading a book. He didn't say a word, but she noticed he glanced at it often, like it grounded him. The healing was slow. Her legs still ached, and there were days the pain returned like a visitor, unwelcome, yet familiar. But the difference now was she no longer faced it alone. Nathan never treated her as fragile. Instead, he treated her like someone capable of rebuilding, not just her body, but her story. The nights once filled with fear became moments of quiet transformation. She would wake from a nightmare, breath short, tears hot, and find Nathan in the chair by her bed, half asleep, but alert enough to whisper, "You're safe. Just breathe." He never asked what she dreamed about. He never needed to. One late afternoon, as a storm rolled low over the cliffs, Clara finally asked, "Why did you save me?" Nathan didn't answer right away. He looked out at the rain dancing against the earth, then turned to her. "Because someone once saved me," he said, "and I couldn't repay them, but I could pay it forward." His words hung in the room like smoke. Clara realized then that this man who had given her everything, shelter, safety, silence, had once needed the same. And maybe, just maybe, her presence here was helping heal him too. As the weeks slipped into months, Clara began to imagine something she hadn't dared in years, a future. Not grand or gilded, but steady. A garden that bloomed. A home filled with laughter, not yelling. A kitchen where tea was brewed just in case. A place where her scars didn't make her less, but more. One evening, after they'd finished dinner, Nathan cleared his throat. She looked up to find his eyes not on the fire, but on her. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice unusually hesitant. "I'd like you to stay, not just until you're better. For good." She blinked. Her hands trembled slightly around her spoon. "You mean?" He nodded. "As my wife, if you want that." Silence fell again, but not the cold silence she'd known with her father. This was the kind that came before something beautiful. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I need time." He nodded, no hurt in his expression, only understanding. "Take all the time you need," he replied. Then, after a pause, added, "There's something you should know. I can't give you children. I want to be honest before you decide." Clara looked at him not as a man missing something, but as a man who had given everything. "You've already given me more than I ever thought I'd have," she said softly. She didn't say yes. Not yet. But in the quiet that followed, she reached across the table and took his hand. He didn't flinch, he only smiled. And in that small gesture, something solid was built. Not just shelter, not just survival, but the start of a home. The knock came just after supper. Not a soft, polite knock, but a jarring, heavy thud that made the walls of the cabin tremble. It was the kind of sound that didn't ask for permission, it demanded attention. Nathan had just finished drying the last dish when it echoed again, sharper, more urgent. Scout barked once, then growled low, his body tense by the door. Clara, seated by the fire with the sketch pad resting on her lap, felt her hand go still. Her heart, which had only recently learned the rhythm of peace, began to stumble. Nathan moved toward the door. His shoulders, always steady, seemed to tighten beneath his shirt. He opened it slowly, and there, framed by the fading light and shadows of dusk, stood John Whitmore. Time hadn't softened him. If anything, it had carved deeper lines into his face, made his eyes sharper, colder. He stood like he owned the ground beneath him, even though it wasn't his. Even though he'd thrown his daughter away like trash on that very kind of dirt. "So, this is where you ended up," he said, glancing past Nathan as if the man in the doorway were a mere obstacle. Without waiting for an invitation, John pushed past him, boots dragging red dust onto the worn wooden floor. Scout growled again, and this time Nathan didn't hold him back. But the dog didn't lunge. He simply stayed close to Clara, whose body had gone rigid. John's gaze swept the room, lingering on the warmth in the walls, the softness of the lighting, the drawing pinned above the hearth. He scoffed. "You've made yourself real comfortable," he muttered, his voice like gravel. "Playing house out here." Nathan stepped beside Clara, quiet but solid. "What do you want?" "Mr. Whitmore." John turned, his jaw tightening. "I need her back. Lost 2 hands to fever. Another ran off. The ranch is falling apart." He looked at Clara now, not with concern, not with regret, but with expectation, as if nothing had happened. As if months hadn't passed since he left her broken in the desert. "You know the work," he said. "You can handle it." Clara didn't move. Her breath came shallow, her fingers clutching the edge of the chair. The fire crackled behind her, the only sound brave enough to interrupt the silence. Nathan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. She's not going anywhere. John laughed, short and bitter. "You think you can protect her? You don't know what she's like. Always been a burden, dreamer, soft, weak." Clara flinched. Not at his words, but at the familiarity of them. How many times had she heard that refrain? How many times had she believed it? But now there was something else. A strength that hadn't existed before. A fire that hadn't burned in her voice when she first arrived. She stood. It wasn't graceful. Her knees still ached, her balance uncertain. But she rose, leaning on the cane Nathan had carved for her, and looked her father in the eye. "I am not a burden," she said, her voice steady. "I'm not soft, I'm not weak, I'm still here, aren't I?" John narrowed his eyes. "You wouldn't have survived without him." Clara nodded. "Maybe not. But I did survive. And I'm not going back. Not now. Not ever." There was no yelling, no dramatic confrontation, just truth laid bare. She walked slowly to the desk drawer and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She handed it to him. It was a drawing, rough but unmistakable. A small figure standing alone under a giant scorched sun. In the distance, a house with boarded windows and a smoke curling from the chimney. "That's what I remember," she said. John took the drawing, looked at it, then let it fall to the floor. "You'll regret this," he muttered, turning toward the door. "When winter comes, when he can't keep you warm, when that patch of dirt turns into a grave." Nathan moved then, calmly but firmly. "Leave." John paused, like he might say more. But he didn't. Instead, he stepped outside and disappeared into the shadows. The door closed behind him with a quiet finality. For a long moment no one spoke. Clara's legs trembled, but she stayed standing. Nathan reached for her hand, grounding her. Scout laid his head at her feet. She looked at the door. He'll come back. Nathan shook his head. Maybe, but next time you won't be afraid. She nodded. I'm not afraid now. That night they didn't speak much. They sat by the fire wrapped in a silence that felt earned, not empty. Clara traced the grooves in the cane Nathan had made, felt the strength in her own voice echoing in her chest. And somewhere deep inside her a final thread snapped. Not the kind that leaves you broken, but the kind that sets you free. She had faced the man who once defined her worth, and this time she had defined it herself. The knock had come, but it had meant nothing, because now she knew who she was. The first sign was quiet, so quiet that Clara almost missed it. It wasn't pain or panic, but a whisper in her bones. Something had shifted. She awoke before dawn one morning and felt it not wrong, not even uncomfortable. Just different, like her body was speaking a new language, and though she didn't yet understand it, she knew enough to listen. She didn't mention it to Nathan, not at first. For days she sat with the feeling in silence, letting it bloom and press against her thoughts. She told herself it was probably nothing, a change in routine, a leftover ache. But then came the queasiness in the morning, the weight behind her eyes, the quiet certainty building beneath her skin like the early signs of spring. On a chilly morning, laced with fog, she made the slow journey to town. The walk took longer than before, her cane steady in hand, her breath short but determined. She didn't look for anyone. She walked straight to the back of the general store where Miss Louise, the town's midwife and quiet miracle worker, kept her tea and wisdom. Miss Louise didn't need a word. One glance at Clara and she smiled. "There's a light in you today, child," she said gently. "Let's see what God's been working on." The exam was silent, tender. When it was done, Miss Louise sat beside her and took her hand. "You're going to be a mother, Clara." The words landed like soft thunder. Clara stared at the floor, unable to speak. A mother. She never let herself imagine it. Not after what Nathan had told her months before, not after what she'd lived through. But there it was, unshakable. Tears came first, thick, quiet, cleansing tears. Then came the question, how? But the midwife only smiled. Some things don't ask for permission. They just arrive. Clara made her way home with a mind full of wonder and fear and awe. When she stepped through the cabin door, Nathan looked up from the hearth. He saw her face and stood as if something in him already knew. She reached for his hands. "Nathan," she said softly, "we're going to have a baby." He didn't move. For a moment he just looked at her like he'd forgotten how to speak. "But I thought..." She nodded, smiling through tears. "So did I. But somehow, here we are." He gathered her into his arms and held her like the earth might fall away. There were no questions, no doubts, just the quiet, steady presence of a man who had once thought his story had ended and now realized it had only just begun. They named her Hope. The months that followed were filled with small miracles. Nathan carved a cradle from pine wood, smoothing each edge with loving care. Clara stitched tiny quilts, painted wildflowers on the nursery walls, and pressed dried lavender into every drawer. Scout stayed near her always, his loyalty turning from protector to silent guardian. The neighbors, once distant, began to visit. They brought herbs, bread, and stories. They called the baby growing in Clara's belly a miracle. They said the land itself must have given her life as a gift for what had been endured. But Clara knew better. She didn't believe in fair trades with fate. She believed in grace, the kind that came not because you earned it, but because you never gave up. Hope came into the world during a summer storm just as the sky cracked open with light and sound. Clara labored long into the night with Nathan beside her, every breath, every cry. Miss Louise kept her steady, her voice low and sure. And then, in the hush that followed the storm, a new cry pierced the air, sharp, strong, undeniable. A daughter. Clara wept as she held her, not out of fear or exhaustion, but reverence. She traced her fingers along the baby's brow, the soft curve of her lips, the tiny hands curled like blossoms. "She has your eyes," Nathan whispered. Clara shook her head. "No, she has my mother's." And somehow that made it feel even more right. Life unfolded gently after that. The cabin, once a place of refuge, became a home in the truest sense. Clara opened her garden to children in the area, teaching them to paint, to listen to the wind, to believe in beauty. Nathan taught local boys how to work with their hands, how to build without taking too much from the land. Hope grew quickly, a child made of laughter and wonder. She had Nathan's quiet soul and Clara's fire. She chased butterflies, collected pine cones, and asked questions about everything. At night she curled between them under the same quilt that once warmed Clara through her darkest hours. Now it was filled with life and love. One evening, years later, Clara stood on the porch watching Hope chase fireflies beneath the lavender dusk. Nathan joined her, his arm warm around her shoulders. "I used to wonder how my story would end," Clara said softly. Nathan kissed the top of her head. "I think it's just beginning." She leaned into him, the smell of juniper and home filling her senses. The land around them, once marked by sorrow, now echoed with songs of second chances. The girl who had been discarded, who once believed her life ended in the dust, had become a woman who created beauty, nurtured growth, and taught others how to begin again. Because sometimes the greatest miracle isn't the one that defies nature, but the one that rises steady and sure from a broken heart that refused to stay broken. Hope had her mother's eyes, and the world would never be the same. Clara Whitmore's journey began in dust and silence, abandoned on the edge of nowhere by the very man who should have protected her. At 17, she was discarded, deemed useless and weak, left with broken bones and a breaking spirit under the merciless Arizona sun. And yet, from that desolate place, something extraordinary began to grow. Not overnight, not all at once, but moment by moment, in the stillness of healing, in the presence of gentleness, and in the quiet bravery of allowing herself to be loved. Nathan Hale didn't rescue Clara with grand gestures. He didn't ride in with declarations or demands. He simply showed up. He listened. He stayed. In a world that often praises noise and speed, he offered something more powerful: patience. Through his steady presence, Clara found space to breathe, to rebuild, to rediscover the person she had always been beneath the pain. Their connection was born not from romance, but from recognition. Two broken souls finding strength in one another, not to erase the past, but to outgrow it. Clara's transformation was never about revenge or proving her worth. It was about reclaiming her story. She went from a girl discarded like debris to a woman who created a sanctuary, a cabin that pulsed with life, laughter, and second chances. Her scars didn't fade, but they softened. They became the soil from which her strength bloomed. And then came the miracle she never dared imagine: hope. A child conceived not in certainty, but in defiance of every doubt. A child who carried the legacy of survival in her tiny hands. When Clara held her daughter, she held every piece of herself that had ever been told she wasn't enough. Hope was not just a name. She was a promise that even in the deepest wounds, something beautiful could take root. Their story didn't end with a wedding or a sunset. It continued in the small sacred rhythms of everyday life, in Nathan sanding wood by the porch, in Clara painting sunflowers on the garden gate, in Hope chasing fireflies barefoot across the yard. It continued in the way their home became a haven for others, the lost, the curious, the children who needed a safe place to dream. Visitors brought stories and left with a little more peace. Clara taught painting, Nathan taught carpentry, and together they taught people how to begin again. As hope grew, so did the spirit of their home. It was no longer a place just for survival, it became a symbol. People began to call it the Mesa House, a place where hearts could mend. Local townsfolk would visit not only for the bread Clara baked or the tools Nathan repaired, but for the warmth they offered simply by being who they were, two people who had found love not through perfection, but through perseverance. And as they aged, Clara and Nathan learned something even deeper, that every chapter, no matter how quiet, holds meaning. That even the simplest acts like reading a bedtime story or planting new flowers echo with significance when done with love. Hope grew into a young woman with bright eyes and a curious mind. She painted just like her mother. She built things with her father. She learned that kindness is strength and softness is not weakness. What can we take from Clara's story? First, that beginnings do not define us. Clara's life started in hardship, in rejection. But beginnings are not verdicts. They are simply the first chapter. No matter how broken or forgotten you may feel, your next chapter can be the one where everything changes, where you stop surviving and start living. Second, that love, true love, is not always loud. It isn't always fireworks or fairy tales. Sometimes it's the hand that brushes your hair from your face when you're too weak to speak. Sometimes it's the man who waits silently by your side through long nights. Sometimes it's a carved cane, a cup of tea, or a cradle built from pine. Third, that healing is not linear. It's messy, slow, and often comes in waves. You don't wake up one day and feel whole. You rebuild piece by piece, day by day. And some days the bravest thing you'll do is keep going. Fourth, that we all need someone to believe in us when we forget how. Nathan didn't try to fix Clara. He simply stood beside her until she could stand on her own. Be that person for someone, or let someone be that for you. And finally, that hope is never foolish. To hope is not to deny pain, but to believe that pain doesn't have the final word. Hope is a quiet rebellion, a seed planted in barren soil, a whisper that says, "This isn't the end." So, wherever you are in your journey, if you've been hurt, silenced, or made to feel small, know this: your story isn't finished. Like Clara, you may find that the things meant to break you are the very things that lead you to your purpose. You may discover that you are stronger, softer, and more radiant than you ever knew. And just maybe like Clara, your greatest legacy will not be what you built, but how you made others feel safe enough to rebuild. And if this story moved you, if it sparked a tear, a memory, a flicker of something long buried, we invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to our channel. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Because here at Wild West Stories, we don't just tell tales of the past, we remind you that courage, love, and hope are timeless. Your support fuels us. Your presence matters. Subscribe now and ride with us into the next story, because in the wildest places the truest hearts shine the brightest. And because sometimes all it takes is one story to remind you you are not alone.